With the PPMS meeting coming up in June, we wanted to spend a few weeks on the PPMS calls and through these slideshows and information, sharing some of the basic fundamentals of why we chose the topic metrics that matter and what that topic really means. We'll provide a few fundamental concepts, and ultimately in a few weeks we're going to give out an assignment that the different project teams are going to complete prior to the meeting. So let's look at the concept of metrics. If we look in the dictionary, in Webster's dictionary, and you look up the word metric, you see a definition, the most appropriate definition, a standard of measurement. If you go look up the word measure, what you see is a basis or standard of comparison. Well, that tells you a little bit, but it doesn't tell you a whole lot about metrics and why we're looking at them. So if you go to the business dictionary and you look up metrics, the definition is standards of measure by which efficiency, performance, progress, or quality of a plan, process, or product can be assessed. Now that comes, I think, a little bit closer to articulating what it really is we're trying to convey. So let's think about the metrics that we track and report for our projects on a daily or weekly or monthly basis. When you think about metrics, you think about things like net generation or availability or E4. You may think of something like cost, fuel costs, or if you're a safety EHS person, maybe OSHA recordables or permit exceedances. If you're financial and you're dealing with that on a regular basis, maybe you're looking at gross margin or distributions. And as you think about those metrics, think about which of those metrics really matter the most. Which are the most important for business success? We track a lot of metrics, but which ones really matter the most? So this next slide shows a picture of an Airbus cockpit, and you can see in there all the various instruments and gauges and guides they look at, all the different metrics and measurements that they need to look at to fly the Airbus. Now this slide shows the cockpit of the Space Shuttle Atlantis. Pretty overwhelming if you ask me. So many more gauges even than the Airbus. Now here we see my view to work every day, which is the dashboard of a Toyota Camry. And if you look at this, you see very few gauges. You see the speedometer, the fuel gauge, the temperature gauge, much more simplistic than the Airbus or the Space Shuttle. And that's because, as we've learned to drive, we've realized there's really just a few metrics or a few measurements that most folks are interested in as we drive down the road. Now, a few interesting things to point out here is we've now gone to, instead of gauges, indicator lights. So when you think about your oil pressure, you have a gauge in there. There's something that's measuring the metrics of oil pressure. But in the background, somebody's already done the analysis and set a threshold over which the indicator light's going to come on. And so it's not a gauge that the driver's watching on a moment-by-moment basis. Another interesting aspect to point out is that the gauge to the left of the speedometer is the miles per gallon. Now, my car is a Toyota Camry hybrid. So these days, the metrics that we're watching in cars are miles per gallon. But if you had looked at a dashboard maybe 10 or 15 years ago, you probably would have seen RPMs. That's what they cared about then. How fast can I make this thing go? Now, as cars have evolved, as drivers have evolved, as the environment has evolved, we're looking at different metrics. So back to our question at hand. Which metrics really matter most for our projects? There's many important metrics that we measure and track and record and manage, but which ones really matter most for our business success? And how do I identify and manage the metrics that are really going to move the needle in this project to create additional value or to move a project forward? Albert Einstein had the famous quote that not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. And I think you've all probably heard the phrase, what gets measured gets done. You've probably also heard the phrase, what gets measured gets managed. Now, MESA International, which stands for Manufacturing Enterprise Solutions Association, it's basically an association of a lot of different manufacturing industries. They did a study starting in 2006 and have done a few follow-up studies since. And they've been looking at the aspect of correlating plant performance to business performance. And what they did through the study is they segregated what they called the business movers, which were really the top financial performers of these companies. And through these surveys, they identified some trends, and a few trends related to metrics. One is that these business movers tended to have more effective linkages between the business metrics and the operational metrics. They also tended to have alignment of the metrics from the business level to the plant level down to the line level, and they did it very effectively through employee education, through getting them involved in the metrics planning and tracking process, through automating the data collection and using appropriate and effective dashboards. And they also had a lot timelier display of those results, so those who are actually managing the process or the equipment, well, they're able to see real time the effects of metrics, and we're able to make adjustments on a real-time basis as needed. So using those results as a guide, we're going to explore some of the topics around this metrics that matter concept during the June meeting this year. We're going to look at how key performance metrics need to be aligned with strategic goals and supported by those goals throughout all levels of the project. We're going to look at how the projects are different. And, you know, whether you're a gas plant, a coal plant, a wood plant, a merchant plant, a PPA, whether you're capacity-based, how do we look at the metrics and work within the boundaries of the project to identify those metrics that are most vital for project or performance improvement? We're also going to look at the concept of leading versus lagging indicators. How can we control the process and not the final result? You know, an example of lagging indicator would in safety would be an OSHA recordable. What you're doing is tracking something that has already happened, and you can no longer control the incident, or the recordable accident has happened. If you go further ahead of that process and look at leading indicators, you might be looking at things like inspection results, training, tracking the types of things that can help control the behavior that might lead to those accidents. So how do we get to what's really leading in a process and control that? The benchmarks, we're going to learn about benchmarks and how they should be well thought and well communicated, who should be involved in helping to establish those benchmarks, as well as measuring toward those benchmarks, those who can influence the results. And remember in all of this that metrics by themselves do not improve performance. Really, it's managing the metrics, and it's taking action on those metrics that will help in performance. So one more quote I wanted to include was from our very own Fred Barber. What's good for the plant is good for the enterprise. So this year during the PPMS annual meeting, we're really going to focus on the plants. We're going to look at providing some education around the concept of metrics that matter. We're going to also include a lot of practical planning sessions. We're going to break down and break out groups by project teams to help identify the metrics that we can manage for each of the projects. In the near term, we're going to do some mini talks or pre-meeting talks, we're calling them, on the PPMS calls with some of the basic fundamentals around metrics that matter. We'll probably do that for a few weeks. And then we're working on having a pre-meeting project team assignment where each of the project teams are going to go off and complete this assignment, bring the results to the meeting, and then we're going to have further breakout sessions there. During the talks on the PPMS calls and associated with each of those, we're going to send out some installments of the playbook. So folks will have some information to read and to prepare prior to the conference. All that being said, we look forward to seeing you all in June and getting the first installment of the playbook.